The manila folder slammed shut on Lieutenant Sarah Chen's desk. "Pack your things. You're done here." The colonel's words cut through the humid Georgia air like shattered glass. Her hands trembled as she stared at the discharge papers, the reason typed in cold military font, "Pregnancy." Around her, fellow soldiers avoided eye contact, their silence deafening. 23 years later, the same conference room fell silent as Sarah walked through those doors again. But this time, the stars on her shoulders caught the afternoon light. The men who once turned their backs now stood at attention. Her former colonel, now graying and weathered, sat among them. Sarah approached the podium, her heart steady, her voice about to make history. "What country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and if these stories inspire you, feel free to subscribe." The story began in 1987, when Sarah Chen believed the Army was her calling, her sanctuary, her home. She had enlisted straight out of college, driven by something deeper than patriotism. Her father had fought in Vietnam, coming home broken and bitter. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table in San Francisco's Chinatown. Sarah saw the uniform as her ladder out of poverty, her chance to serve something greater than herself. Basic training at Fort Benning was everything she expected and nothing she was prepared for. The Georgia heat pressed down like a physical weight, but Sarah thrived under it. While other recruits stumbled through obstacle courses, she flew over walls. While they struggled with weapons training, she consistently hit center mass. Her drill sergeant, a mountain of a man named Rodriguez, watched her with grudging respect. "Chen's got steel in her spine," he told his colleagues. "That girl's going places." Sarah believed him. Every morning she woke before réveillé, her boots polished to mirror shine, her uniform pressed to perfection. She studied tactics until her eyes burned, memorized regulations until she could recite them in her sleep. The Army Manual became her Bible, its principles her moral code. After basic, she was stationed at Fort Stewart as a logistics officer. It was exactly where she wanted to be, close enough to combat operations to matter, far enough from her past to breathe. She threw herself into her work with the intensity of someone proving a point to the world. The other officers were polite but distant. She was one of only 12 women officers on base, a curiosity more than a colleague. But Sarah didn't mind the isolation. She had work to do, a career to build, a family legacy to rewrite. That's when she met Marcus. He was a staff sergeant in the motor pool, all easy smiles and gentle hands that could coax life from dead engines. Where Sarah was all sharp edges and military precision, Marcus was warmth and laughter. He would hum while he worked, old blues songs his grandmother taught him, and somehow those melodies found their way into Sarah's dreams. Their first conversation happened over a broken Humvee on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. "Lieutenant, this transmission's deader than last week's fish," Marcus said, wiping grease from his hands. "But I can make her sing again if you got time." Sarah found herself lingering in the motor pool that day, and the next, and the one after that. Marcus would explain what he was doing, his voice patient and kind, and Sarah realized she was learning things they didn't teach in officer school. How to listen to the rhythm of an engine's heartbeat. How to feel when something was wrong before the diagnostics confirmed it. How to fix things that seemed beyond repair. "You got magic hands," she told him one evening as he brought a dead radio back to life. "Nah," he said, glancing up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "Just got to believe things can be whole again." They fell in love the way soldiers do, quickly, intensely, with the knowledge that time is borrowed and tomorrow is never guaranteed. Sarah had never believed in fairy tales, but Marcus made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she deserved one too. Their relationship was against regulations, but they were careful. Stolen moments in the mess hall, brief conversations during inspections, notes passed through mutual friends. It felt dangerous and precious and absolutely right. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked one night as they sat by the base's small lake, hidden among the cypress trees. "The future," Sarah said, her head resting on his shoulder. "I used to think I had it all mapped out. Make captain by 30, major by 35, maybe colonel if I played my cards right. And now?" She turned to look at him, memorizing the way moonlight caught the angles of his face. "Now I think maybe there's more than one way to serve." 3 months later, Sarah stared at the pregnancy test in her quarter's tiny bathroom, watching 2 pink lines appear like a verdict. Her hands shook as she set it on the sink counter, next to her toothbrush and the photo of her parents. She knew what this meant. The Army's policies were clear, inflexible, carved in bureaucratic stone. Pregnant officers were given two choices: resign or be discharged. There was no third option, no appeal process, no consideration for exemplary service records or potential for leadership. Sarah spent that night walking the base perimeter, trying to reconcile the life growing inside her with the career that had defined her. The Georgia air was thick with humidity and the sound of night birds, but all she could hear was the ticking of a clock, counting down her time in uniform. She told Marcus first, finding him in the motor pool before dawn. "We'll figure this out," he said immediately, pulling her into his arms. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out." But there was nothing to figure out. The regulations were absolute. When Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Harrison, she walked into his office with her shoulders straight and her chin up, even though her heart was breaking. Harrison was old-school Army, the kind of officer who still believed women belonged in supportive roles, not leadership ones. "Sir, I need to inform you that I'm pregnant," she said, the words feeling like stones in her throat. Harrison didn't even look up from his paperwork. "How many weeks?" "8, sir. Medical will confirm. You'll have your discharge papers by Friday." "Sir, I'd like to request—" "There's nothing to request, Lieutenant. Army regulations are clear. Pregnant officers cannot serve." Sarah felt something crumble inside her chest, like a building collapsing floor by floor. "Sir, with respect, I've served with distinction. My performance evaluations are irrelevant." Harrison finally looked up, his gray eyes cold as winter rain. "You made your choice when you decided to get pregnant. Now live with the consequences." The hearing was a formality, a parade of regulations read aloud while Sarah sat in her dress uniform for what she knew would be the last time. The board of officers, all men, all stone-faced, barely looked at her service record. Her commendations meant nothing. Her potential meant nothing. She was a problem to be processed, a deviation from protocol to be corrected. "Lieutenant Chen," the board president said, his voice as flat as a bureaucratic form, "you are hereby discharged from active duty, effective immediately, due to pregnancy. You will surrender all military property and vacate base housing within 72 hours. Sarah stood, saluted one final time, and walked out of that room feeling like a ghost of herself. The worst part wasn't the discharge itself. It was the silence that followed. Fellow officers who had shared meals with her, laughed at her jokes, sought her advice on tactical problems. They all looked through her as if she'd become invisible. In the Army's eyes, she had ceased to exist the moment she chose motherhood over military service. Packing her quarters felt like dismantling her identity piece by piece. Each folded uniform, each medal returned to its case, each book on military strategy boxed away. It all represented a future that was no longer hers. Marcus found her sitting on her bare mattress on her last night, staring at her empty wall where her commission certificate had hung. "I had it all planned out," she whispered. "Every step, every promotion, every assignment. And now you've got something better," he said, sitting beside her and placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Now you've got us." She wanted to believe him. But as she drove through the base gates for the last time, watching Fort Stewart disappear in her rearview mirror, Sarah felt like she was leaving more than a job behind. She was leaving herself. The transition to civilian life was brutal. Sarah had never written a resume, never interviewed for a corporate job, never had to explain why someone should hire an ex-military officer whose career ended in discharge. The pregnancy made it worse. Potential employers would smile politely during interviews, then never call back. "We're looking for someone with long-term commitment," they would say, eyes flicking to her growing belly. Sarah and Marcus moved into a tiny apartment in Savannah, surviving on his savings and her growing desperation. She took a job at a package delivery company, sorting boxes in a warehouse that smelled like cardboard and broken dreams. Her supervisor was a man half her age who called her sweetheart and seemed to take pleasure in assigning her the heaviest loads. "You sure you can handle this, sweetheart?" he would ask, smirking as Sarah lifted boxes that would have challenged men twice her size. Every day she bit back responses that would have earned her respect in the Army and unemployment in civilian Georgia. Her military training made her efficient, precise, reliable, qualities that seemed to irritate rather than impress her coworkers. "Why you always gotta be so perfect?" asked Denise, the woman who worked the station next to hers. "Makes the rest of us look bad." Sarah wanted to explain that perfection wasn't a choice for her, it was survival. In the Army, attention to detail meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But here, it just made her a target for resentment. The baby came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Emma Sarah Chen arrived 8 pounds and 2 ounces of pure determination, her lungs announcing her presence to the entire maternity ward. When the nurse placed her in Sarah's arms, something fundamental shifted in the universe's alignment. "Look at her," Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Look at our daughter." Sarah stared into Emma's dark eyes and saw not the end of her military dreams, but the beginning of something she hadn't known she needed. This tiny person, red-faced and perfect, was worth every sacrifice, every humiliation, every moment of doubt. But love didn't pay rent or buy formula or provide health insurance. Sarah returned to the warehouse 6 weeks later, leaving Emma with a babysitter who charged more per hour than Sarah made. The work was mind-numbing, her supervisor still called her sweetheart, and every paycheck barely covered their basic expenses. At night, she would hold Emma and whisper promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Mommy's going to give you a better life," she would say. "Somehow, someway, things are going to get better." Marcus proposed on Emma's first birthday, presenting Sarah with his grandmother's ring in their cramped living room, while their daughter played with wrapping paper on the floor. "I know things are tight," he said, dropping to one knee beside Emma's high chair. "I know this isn't how we planned it. But I love you, Sarah Chen, and I want to build a life with you. A real life, not just survival." Sarah said yes through tears she didn't know she was crying. They married 2 months later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Emma in a tiny white dress, Marcus in his only suit, Sarah in a blue dress she'd bought at a thrift store. It wasn't the military wedding she'd once imagined, but it was perfect in its imperfection. The years that followed were a blur of working and scraping and making do. Sarah bounced between jobs. Warehouse worker, administrative assistant, retail manager, each one a step further from the leader she'd been trained to be. Emma grew from baby to toddler to little girl, bright and curious and completely unaware that her mother had once commanded soldiers. But something was stirring in the wider world. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Women in combat units proved themselves in the Gulf War. Slowly, incrementally, the military Sarah had been forced to leave was changing. In 1993, Sarah read in the newspaper that the combat exclusion for women had been lifted. She stared at the article for a long time, Emma coloring quietly at the kitchen table beside her. "What's that, Mommy?" Emma asked, looking up from her drawing. "History," Sarah said softly. "That's history happening." The idea came slowly, like dawn breaking over water. If the military was changing, if women were finally being recognized as full soldiers rather than auxiliary support, maybe, just maybe, there was a path back. Sarah began studying again, devouring military journals and defense publications. She earned her master's degree in international relations through night classes, writing papers on military strategy while Emma slept. Marcus would find her at the kitchen table at midnight, textbooks spread around her like battle plans. "What are you planning?" he asked one night, settling into the chair across from her. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I'm getting ready for something." The something came in 1997, when Sarah read about a new program allowing former military personnel to return to service under specific circumstances. The requirements were stringent, the process competitive, but for the first time in 10 years, Sarah saw a door that might be opened. She submitted her application knowing it was a long shot. Her discharge was still on her record, a permanent mark that labeled her as someone who had chosen family over service. But her academic record was stellar. Her civilian work history showed progression and leadership, and the military was desperate for experienced officers as it downsized and restructured. The interview took place at Fort Benning, the same base where she'd completed basic training 15 years earlier. Sarah drove through those gates in her only business suit, her hands steady on the steering wheel, Emma's photo tucked in her purse for luck. The panel consisted of 3 colonels and a general, all men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Chen," the general began, consulting her file, "your military record shows a discharge due to pregnancy. Can you explain why you believe the Army should give you a second chance?" Sarah had practiced this answer for weeks, but sitting in that chair, facing those skeptical faces, all her prepared responses evaporated. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I was discharged for making a choice to become a mother. That choice taught me things about leadership, sacrifice, and strategic thinking that no military manual could provide. I learned how to make life or death decisions with incomplete information." I learned how to motivate people who don't want to be motivated. I learned how to find solutions when there are no good options. These aren't civilian skills, sir. These are command skills. One of the colonels leaned forward. You're saying pregnancy made you a better officer? I'm saying motherhood made me a better leader. The room fell silent. Sarah could hear her heartbeat, could feel the weight of every hope she'd carried into this room. We'll be in touch, the general said finally. 3 weeks later, Sarah received her orders. She was being recommissioned as a major, assigned to the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division. After 10 years in exile, she was coming home. Emma, now 10 years old, helped her mother pack dress uniforms with the same intensity she brought to her homework. Are you nervous, Mom? She asked, carefully folding Sarah's ribbons into their presentation box. Terrified, Sarah admitted, but the good kind of terrified. Like before a big test? Like before the most important test of my life. The Pentagon was everything Sarah remembered and nothing like she expected. The building itself was the same maze of corridors and conference rooms, but the culture had shifted. Women in uniform were no longer novelties. They were commanders, strategists, leaders who belonged. Sarah's first assignment was analyzing post-Cold War force restructuring. It was technical work, heavy on statistics and light on glory, but she approached it with the intensity of someone who knew every opportunity might be her last. Her reports were thorough, her recommendations innovative, her presentations flawless. Major Chen, her supervisor, Colonel Martinez, told her after her first quarterly review, "Your work is exceptional, but you're holding back. I can see it in your posture, hear it in your voice. What's the problem?" Sarah stared at the wall behind Martinez's desk, where his commendations hung in neat rows. "Sir, I'm aware that my circumstances for returning to service are unusual. I don't want to presume—" "Stop right there." Martinez leaned forward, his expression intense. "You're not here because we felt sorry for you. You're here because you earned it. Start acting like it." It was exactly what Sarah needed to hear and exactly what she'd been afraid to believe. Over the next 2 years, Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed confidence. She developed strategic frameworks for peacekeeping operations, authored policy papers on military family support, and slowly began to speak up in meetings where her voice could make a difference. The breakthrough came during a crisis in the Balkans. Traditional military approaches weren't working, and the Joint Chiefs were struggling to develop an effective strategy. Sarah had been studying the situation, developing what she called a humanitarian first approach that prioritized civilian protection while achieving military objectives. In a room full of generals and senior colonels, Major Sarah Chen stood up and presented a strategy that would later be credited with saving thousands of lives and stabilizing the region. "The key," she explained, pointing to maps spread across the conference table, "is understanding that in modern conflicts, winning hearts and minds isn't just good public relations, it's tactical necessity. We need to think like parents as much as soldiers, protectors as much as warriors." General Thompson, the Joint Chiefs chairman, studied her proposal for long minutes while the room held its breath. "This is brilliant," he said finally. "Unconventional but brilliant. Major Chen, I want you to brief the Secretary of Defense personally." That briefing led to Sarah's promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment to the Joint Staff, where she became the Pentagon's go-to expert on complex humanitarian military operations. Her strategies were implemented across 3 continents, her innovations adopted as standard protocol. But success brought its own challenges. Sarah was often the only woman in high-level meetings, the only officer with a non-traditional career path, the only one who understood what it meant to lose everything and fight to get it back. "Some of the old guard aren't happy about your rapid advancement," Colonel Martinez warned her during a private meeting. "They think you're getting special treatment because of your gender." "What do you think?" Sarah asked. "I think you're getting results, and results don't have gender." Emma, now in high school, watched her mother's career with pride and bewilderment. "Mom, you're like famous in military circles," she said one evening, showing Sarah an article about women in the Pentagon. "There's a whole section about you." Sarah read the article with mixed emotions. The coverage was positive, but it focused as much on her inspiring comeback story as her professional achievements. "I don't want to be famous for being a woman who succeeded," she told Marcus that night. "I want to be famous for succeeding, period." "Maybe both things can be true," he suggested. Maybe your success means more because of what you had to overcome to achieve it. In 2003, Sarah was promoted to colonel and given command of the 3rd Logistics Brigade, her first field command since her discharge 16 years earlier. Standing in front of 2,000 soldiers, men and women, officers and enlisted, veterans and newcomers, Sarah felt the weight of every step that had brought her to this moment. "I know what some of you are thinking," she told them during her 1st Brigade assembly. "You're wondering if I'm tough enough, experienced enough, committed enough to lead you. Those are fair questions, but I'm not here to prove I deserve this command. I'm here to prove that together, we can accomplish things none of us could achieve alone." Her leadership style was unlike anything her soldiers had experienced. Sarah was demanding but supportive, strategic but compassionate, military but unmistakably human. She knew every soldier's name, remembered their families, celebrated their successes, and helped them through their failures. When the brigade deployed to Afghanistan, Sarah's unconventional approach proved its worth. Her units had the highest mission success rate and lowest casualty numbers in theater. More importantly, they had the highest re-enlistment rate, suggesting that soldiers wanted to continue serving under her command. "Ma'am," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez told her during one of their evening briefings, "the troops would follow you anywhere. That's not something you can teach or fake. That's just who you are." The commendations began piling up: Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, Defense Superior Service Medal. Each award was recognition not just of Sarah's achievements, but of her soldiers' trust in her leadership. But the recognition Sarah treasured most came from an unexpected source. During a ceremony honoring military families, Emma, now a college junior studying international relations, stood to address the audience. "My mother once told me that the Army discharged her for choosing to be a mother," Emma said, her voice clear and proud. "What they didn't understand is that being my mother made her a better soldier. She learned that true strength isn't about following orders, it's about knowing when to question them. She learned that real leadership isn't about commanding respect, it's about earning it. She learned that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, they're won in the quiet moments when you choose to keep fighting even when everyone tells you to give up." Sarah wiped away tears as her daughter continued, "Today she's not just my mother. She's Colonel Sarah Chen, and she's about to become something more. Something this country has never seen before." Emma was right. The promotion board results came 2 weeks later. Sarah was selected for Brigadier General, making her the first woman in the Army's history to achieve general officer rank after returning from a pregnancy discharge. The ceremony was scheduled for the same base where she'd been discharged 23 years earlier. Fort Stewart had changed dramatically. Women now served in combat roles, family support programs were robust, and pregnancy was no longer a career death sentence. But Sarah still remembered the young lieutenant who had walked through these gates in shame and heartbreak. Colonel Harrison, now retired but invited as a guest, approached Sarah before the ceremony. "General Chen," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked at this man who had once dismissed her as a problem to be processed. Age had softened his edges, but his eyes still held that military intensity. "Sir, that's not necessary," she said. "Yes, it is. I was wrong about you. Wrong about what the Army needed? Wrong about what leadership looks like?" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "You became everything I should have seen you could be, despite my failure to recognize it. Sir, we both served according to the regulations of our time. The important thing is that those regulations changed. They changed because people like you fought to change them. That takes a courage I'm not sure I possessed." The ceremony itself was a blur of protocol and pageantry, but certain moments burned themselves into Sarah's memory with perfect clarity. The moment when Emma pinned the general's star on her mother's uniform, her hands steady with pride. The moment when Marcus whispered, "I told you so," in her ear as she took the oath. The moment when every soldier on base stood at attention as she walked to the podium for her first address as a general. But the moment that mattered most came when Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd and saw not just soldiers and families, but possibilities. Young women in uniform who would never have to choose between service and motherhood. Young men who would serve under female commanders and think nothing of it. Children who would grow up in a military that valued competence over conformity. 23 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, I was discharged from this base for being pregnant. I was told that I had to choose between being a soldier and being a mother, that I couldn't be both, that service and family were incompatible. She paused, finding Emma in the crowd, then Marcus, then the faces of soldiers who represented the future she was helping to build. Today, I stand before you as proof that we are more than the sum of our individual choices. We are the product of our resilience, our determination, and our refusal to accept limitations that serve no purpose except tradition. The army that discharged me was not wrong to uphold its regulations, but the army that promoted me was right to change them. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about the scared young lieutenant who had packed her belongings in shame, the struggling mother who had sorted packages in a warehouse, the determined woman who had fought her way back to this moment. Service comes in many forms, she continued. Sometimes it's leading soldiers in combat. Sometimes it's raising children who will serve their communities. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give up when everyone tells you that your dreams are impossible. Today, I want every young person here to understand that your path to service may not look like anyone else's. It may be interrupted, redirected, or delayed. But if you have the courage to keep walking, you will find your way to where you belong. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself alone for a moment in her new office, looking at the photo of Emma as a baby that she'd carried through every assignment, every challenge, every moment of doubt. A knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Her aide, a young captain named Williams, stepped inside. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal." A woman in civilian clothes entered, nervous and determined in equal measure. She was young, maybe 25, with the rigid posture that marked her as military even in street clothes. "General Chen, my name is Lieutenant Amanda Foster. I was discharged from the Navy 6 months ago for being pregnant. I read about your promotion in the newspaper and I wanted to know if you had any advice." Sarah studied this young woman who reminded her so much of herself at that age, proud, hurt, confused about where to go next. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Sarah said gently. "Tell me your story." For the next hour, Sarah listened as Amanda described her own journey through discharge, civilian struggle, and desperate hope for a second chance. It was like hearing her own story told by someone else, with different details but the same emotional core. "The thing is," Amanda concluded, "I don't know if I should fight to get back in or just accept that this chapter of my life is over." Sarah leaned back in her chair, remembering Martinez's words from years ago. "Lieutenant, let me ask you something. Do you believe you're a good sailor?" "Yes, ma'am. I was ranked first in my class at OCS, had perfect fitness scores, and received commendations for—" "That's not what I asked. Do you believe you're a good sailor?" Amanda stopped reciting her achievements and really considered the question. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Then the Navy needs you, whether they know it right now or not. The question isn't whether you should fight to get back in. The question is whether you're willing to do the work necessary to make yourself impossible to ignore." Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon outlining a plan for Amanda's return to service, drawing on her own experience and the lessons learned through years of proving herself repeatedly. As the young woman left, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced before, the deep satisfaction of passing on hard-won wisdom to someone who needed it. Over the following months, General Chen's office became an unofficial way station for women whose military careers had been interrupted by pregnancy, family obligations, or institutional barriers. Sarah met with them individually, offering advice, connections, and most importantly, proof that second chances were possible. "You're building something here," Marcus observed one evening as Sarah reviewed files for 3 women seeking to return to service. "It's bigger than your own career." "I'm just paying forward what others did for me," Sarah replied. "Colonel Martinez took a chance on me. General Thompson believed in my ideas. You supported me through the hardest years. Success isn't just about individual achievement, it's about lifting others as you climb." Emma, now graduated from college and working at the State Department, visited her mother's office one afternoon and was struck by the steady stream of women seeking guidance. "Mom, you've become like a patron saint for military mothers," she said, watching a young Air Force captain leave Sarah's office with tears of hope in her eyes. "I've become what I needed when I was their age," Sarah corrected. "Someone who could prove it was possible." The impact of Sarah's work extended far beyond individual counseling sessions. Her policy recommendations led to comprehensive reforms in military family support, pregnancy accommodation, and career flexibility. The Chen Protocols, as they became known throughout the Pentagon, established frameworks for maintaining military readiness while supporting service members through major life transitions. But perhaps her greatest achievement was cultural rather than policy-based. By 2010, General Sarah Chen had become a symbol of possibility within military circles. Her story was taught at officer training schools, not as an inspiring anecdote, but as a case study in adaptive leadership and organizational change. "The thing about General Chen," said Colonel Martinez, now retired but still following his former protégé's career, "is that she didn't just overcome discrimination, she transformed it into institutional wisdom. The military is stronger because of what she endured and how she channeled that experience into positive change." Sarah's influence extended internationally as well. Foreign military leaders sought her consultation on integrating women into their forces. Her strategic frameworks were adopted by NATO allies. Academic institutions invited her to speak on leadership, resilience, and organizational transformation. But for all her professional success, Sarah's proudest moment came during Emma's wedding to a fellow State Department officer. As Sarah watched her daughter dance with her new husband, surrounded by friends and family that included soldiers, diplomats, and defense contractors, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them all together. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Marcus asked, joining her at the edge of the dance floor. "Just marveling at how different this is from what I imagined 25 years ago," Sarah replied. "I thought I had to choose between family and service. I never imagined I could have both, and that having both would make me better at each." "Any regrets?" Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. The path had been harder than it needed to be, full of obstacles that served no legitimate purpose except perpetuating outdated traditions. But those obstacles had also shaped her into the leader she became. "I regret the policies that forced impossible choices on women like me," she said finally. "But I don't regret the journey. Every struggle taught me something I needed to know. Every setback prepared me for a greater challenge. Every moment when I wanted to quit but didn't made me stronger." In 2012, President Obama nominated General Sarah Chen for promotion to 2-star rank and assignment as Deputy Commander of U.S. Forces Korea. The Senate confirmation hearing was a formality. Sarah's record spoke for itself, but the symbolism was profound. The young woman who had been discharged for pregnancy was now responsible for strategic military operations affecting global security. During her confirmation testimony, Senator Patricia Williams of California asked the question everyone was thinking. "General Chen, your career path has been unconventional to say the least. What advice would you give to young women considering military service?" Sarah looked out at the packed hearing room, seeing faces of all ages and backgrounds, all waiting for her answer. "Senator, I would tell them that service is not a straight line from point A to point B. It's a journey of adaptation, growth, and constant learning. There will be moments when you feel like you don't belong, when others question your commitment, when circumstances force you to make difficult choices. But if you remember why you chose to serve in the first place, whether that's protecting your country, leading others, or simply proving to yourself what you're capable of, then you'll find a way through any obstacle." She paused, thinking of Amanda Foster and dozens of other women who had sought her guidance over the years. "Most importantly, I would tell them that their path doesn't have to look like mine or anyone else's. The military needs different kinds of leaders, different perspectives, different experiences. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can bring to service is exactly what makes you different from everyone else who came before you." The confirmation was unanimous. As Sarah prepared for her assignment in Korea, she reflected on how far not just she, but the entire military had traveled. Women now served in combat roles, led major commands, and made up nearly 20% of the force. Military families received comprehensive support during deployments and life transitions. Pregnancy was treated as a temporary condition, not a career-ending diagnosis. But change, Sarah knew, was an ongoing process requiring constant vigilance. During her farewell ceremony at the Pentagon, she addressed a crowd that included many of the women she had mentored over the years. "When I was discharged in 1987, I thought my story was ending," she said. "I couldn't imagine that 25 years later, I would be standing here as a 2-star general, addressing an audience that includes dozens of women who have overcome their own obstacles to serve their country with distinction." She found Amanda Foster in the crowd, now Commander Foster, having successfully returned to Navy service and earned her own promotion. But this isn't really my story, Sarah continued. It's our story. Every woman who refused to accept limitations that served no purpose. Every leader who was willing to question outdated policies. Every family member who supported someone through the long journey back to service. Every person in this room who believes that merit, not tradition, should determine who gets to serve their country. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, but Sarah barely noticed. She was looking at Emma, now married and working on her own career in public service, and seeing in her daughter's face all the possibilities that had been preserved by refusing to give up. Later that evening, as Sarah packed her office for the final time, she came across a folder she hadn't opened in years. Inside were copies of her original discharge papers, the documents that had ended her first military career with such finality. She read through them again, noting the cold language, the bureaucratic tone, the complete absence of recognition for the 8 years of service that had preceded that single disqualifying event. Then she looked at her promotion orders for Major General, the language warm with recognition of distinguished service and exceptional leadership. Marcus found her there, holding both documents side by side. "Quite a contrast," he observed. "It's the same person," Sarah said wonderingly. "These papers are describing the same person, 25 years apart. The only difference is that one organization saw a problem to be eliminated and another saw potential to be developed. Which one was right?" Sarah smiled, filing both sets of papers in the box marked "Personal, Keep Forever." They both were. The first one was right according to the standards of its time. The second one was right according to the standards we fought to create. The real victory isn't that I succeeded despite being discharged. It's that other women won't have to face that choice at all. On her last day at the Pentagon, Sarah walked through the corridors where she had once felt like an intruder and now felt completely at home. She stopped by the offices of colleagues who had become friends, mentees who had become peers, and superiors who had become trusted advisors. Her final stop was Colonel Martinez's old office, now occupied by Colonel Janet Stevens, one of the women Sarah had mentored 5 years earlier. "Any final words of wisdom?" Stevens asked, echoing the question Sarah had posed to Martinez years ago. "Remember that your success isn't just about you," Sarah said. "Every barrier you break, every stereotype you challenge, every impossible thing you accomplish, it makes the path easier for the women who come after you. That's both a privilege and a responsibility." As Sarah drove away from the Pentagon for the last time in her current assignment, she thought about the scared young lieutenant who had been escorted off Fort Stewart in 1987. That woman could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead, the struggles and triumphs, the defeats and victories, the moments of despair and breakthrough. But perhaps that was the point. The future was impossible to predict, but it was always possible to shape. 6 months into her assignment in Korea, General Chen received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was from a young Army captain named Maria Rodriguez, deployed to Afghanistan. "General Chen," the letter began, "you don't know me, but I know your story. I'm writing from a forward operating base where I command a mixed gender unit in one of the most challenging areas of operation. Yesterday, one of my female soldiers asked me if she could really have both a military career and a family. I told her about you, about how you lost everything and fought to get it back, about how you proved that service and motherhood aren't mutually exclusive, about how you changed an entire institution through your example." The letter continued, "I wanted you to know that your story didn't end with your promotion to general. It continues every day in the choices we make, the standards we uphold, and the doors we hold open for the women who will serve after us. You didn't just break barriers, you showed us how to keep them broken." Sarah read that letter 3 times, then called Emma to share it with her. "Mom," Emma said after hearing the letter, "do you realize what you've done? You've become part of military history. Not just as an individual success story, but as someone who changed the trajectory of an entire institution." "We all did that," Sarah corrected. "Every woman who served despite the barriers, every leader who was willing to change outdated policies, every family that supported someone through the struggle to return to service. Change is never the work of one person." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah knew that individual stories mattered tremendously. Her personal journey from discharge to general officer had become a symbol of possibility that transcended her individual achievements. As her tour in Korea neared its end, Sarah began planning her next phase of service. The Army had offered her a prestigious Pentagon assignment that would likely lead to her 3rd star. But Sarah found herself drawn to a different kind of impact. She submitted her request for retirement, effective after 25 years of active service, almost exactly the same length as her original period of discharge. Her plan was to establish a nonprofit organization focused on helping veterans transition between military and civilian careers, with particular emphasis on women whose service had been interrupted by family obligations. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked when she shared her decision. "You could be the first woman to make 3-star rank from your position." "I could be," Sarah agreed, "but rank isn't the only way to serve. Maybe it's time to focus on the service part and let someone else worry about the stars." Emma supported her mother's decision completely. "You've already proved everything you needed to prove to the institution," she said during one of their weekly phone calls. "Now you can focus on proving things to yourself." The retirement ceremony took place, by Sarah's request, at Fort Stewart, the same base where her military career had both begun and seemingly ended. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. Colonel Harrison, now in his 80s but still sharp, was among the honored guests. As Sarah delivered her retirement address, she looked out at an audience that spanned generations of military service. There were officers who had served under her command, women she had mentored, family members who had supported her through every challenge, and young soldiers who represented the future of an evolving institution. "When I was discharged from this base 28 years ago," she began, "I thought my story was a tragedy. A promising career cut short by an unforgiving system. A young woman who had to choose between service and family and lost everything as a result." She paused, finding faces in the crowd that represented different chapters of her journey. "But I learned something important during the years that followed. Our stories aren't tragedies or triumphs. They're just stories. And the ending is never written until we stop trying to improve it." The young woman who was discharged in 1987 and the general who is retiring today are the same person, shaped by the same experiences, driven by the same desire to serve something greater than herself. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The difference isn't in who I am, but in how I chose to respond to circumstances beyond my control. I could have accepted that discharge as the final word on my military career. I could have embraced bitterness and resentment as appropriate responses to institutional unfairness. I could have decided that if the Army didn't want me, then I didn't want the Army." She looked directly at Amanda Foster, now Commander Foster and serving as Sarah's aide-de-camp for the ceremony. "Instead, I chose to believe that the institution that discharged me was capable of change and that I was capable of becoming someone worth taking back. That required faith. In myself, in the possibility of growth and adaptation, and in the fundamental goodness of people who were willing to look beyond tradition to see potential." The ceremony concluded with Sarah's final salute as an active duty officer. As she held that salute, she thought about all the salutes that had come before: the uncertain salute of a new second lieutenant, the bitter salute of a discharged officer, the determined salute of a returning major, and now this final salute of a retiring general. Each one had been offered by the same person, but each represented a different stage of growth, understanding, and service. At the reception that followed, Sarah was approached by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by her example. There were women who had returned to service after family-related interruptions, men who had learned to see female colleagues as equals rather than exceptions, and young people who had chosen military careers partly because they saw it as an institution capable of change and growth. But the conversation that moved her most came from an unexpected source. A young man in civilian clothes approached her near the end of the evening. "General Chen, my name is David Harrison. Colonel Harrison is my grandfather." Sarah studied this young man's face, seeing echoes of the officer who had once dismissed her so coldly. "He asked me to give you this," David continued, handing her a sealed envelope. "He said you would understand what it meant." Sarah opened the envelope to find a brief handwritten note. "General Chen, you were right and I was wrong. More importantly, you were strong enough to prove it without becoming bitter about it. That's the kind of character the Army needs in its leaders. Thank you for your service. Colonel retired William Harrison." Sarah looked across the room to where Colonel Harrison sat with his family. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that had been 28 years in the making. "Is there anything you'd like me to tell him?" David asked. Sarah thought carefully before responding. "Tell him that we all served according to our understanding at the time. The important thing is that we were both willing to grow beyond those limitations." As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing outside the building where her court-martial had taken place nearly 3 decades earlier. The structure looked the same, but everything else had changed. The base now had robust family support services, flexible career paths for military parents, and policies that recognized service members as whole people rather than interchangeable units. Marcus joined her on the steps, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about time," Sarah replied. "How long it can take to change something that seems permanent. How patient you have to be when you're fighting for something that might not benefit you directly, but will make life better for people who come after you. Any regrets?" Sarah considered the question, as she always did when Marcus asked it. The path had been harder than necessary, marked by obstacles that served no legitimate purpose and setbacks that could have been avoided with more enlightened policies. But those very obstacles had shaped her into the leader she became. "I regret that it took so long," she said finally. "I regret that other women had to face the same impossible choices I faced, but I don't regret the journey itself. Every struggle taught me something I needed to know." Emma joined them on the steps, her own career in public service a testament to growing up with a mother who refused to accept artificial limitations. "So what's next?" Emma asked. "You've conquered the military. Ready to take on civilian leadership?" Sarah laughed. "I'm ready to stop conquering and start building. There are still too many women whose service is interrupted or undervalued, too many talented people who give up instead of fighting their way back, too many institutions that resist change because it's easier than growth." "Sounds like you've got your work cut out for you," Marcus observed. "The best work always does," Sarah replied. The nonprofit organization that Sarah established after retirement became a model for veteran support services nationwide. The Second Chances Foundation helped hundreds of former military personnel return to service after career interruptions, developed corporate partnerships that valued military experience, and lobbied for policy changes that made military service more compatible with modern family life. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a visible reminder that setbacks didn't have to be permanent, that institutions could change, and that individual persistence could create systemic transformation. 5 years after her retirement, Sarah was invited to speak at the Army War College on the topic of adaptive leadership. Her audience consisted of senior officers from around the world, people who would shape military policy for the next generation. "Leadership," she told them, "isn't about following a predetermined path to success. It's about finding a way to serve even when the traditional paths are blocked. It's about helping institutions grow beyond their current limitations while maintaining their essential character and mission." She paused, looking out at faces that represented the future of military leadership. "Some of you will face challenges that force you to choose between competing values, service and family, tradition and progress, individual advancement and collective good. When those moments come, remember that the choice is rarely as binary as it first appears. Most of the time, the real challenge is finding a third option that serves both values more effectively than choosing between them." After her presentation, a young female colonel approached Sarah with a question that had become familiar over the years. "Ma'am, I'm facing a situation similar to yours from 30 years ago. I'm pregnant, and while the policies have changed, the culture in my unit is still pretty traditional. Any advice?" Sarah smiled, remembering all the women who had asked variations of this question over the years. "Colonel, the fact that you're asking the question tells me you already know the answer. You're not choosing between being a soldier and being a mother. You're choosing how to be both. The policies support you now, but more importantly, you have a generation of female leaders who have proven it can be done." "It still feels overwhelming," the colonel admitted. "It should," Sarah replied. "Anything worth doing feels overwhelming at first. The key is to focus on the next step, not the entire journey. Take care of your health, excel at your current assignment, and trust that your career will adapt to accommodate your growing family. The military needs officers who understand that service comes in many forms." As Sarah flew home from that speaking engagement, she reflected on how many times she had given similar advice over the years. Each conversation was unique, but the underlying message was always the same: persistence, adaptability, and faith in the possibility of positive change could overcome almost any obstacle. Emma met her at the airport, now a senior State Department official in her own right and expecting her first child. "How did the speech go?" Emma asked as they drove through the familiar Virginia countryside. "Like they all do," Sarah replied. A room full of smart people asking questions they already know how to answer, but need to be reminded they have the courage to act on. Kind of like you 30 years ago? Exactly like me 30 years ago. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about service, family, and the endless challenge of balancing competing responsibilities. "Mom," Emma said finally, "I need to ask you something. This baby is going to change everything about my career trajectory. Part of me is terrified that I'll have to choose between advancement and motherhood, even though intellectually I know the policies have changed." Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, not for her own struggles, but for the realization that each generation had to learn these lessons anew, that institutional change didn't automatically translate to personal confidence. "Emma, you're not me, and 2018 isn't 1987. You have options I didn't have, support systems that didn't exist, and a generation of women who have proven that excellence and motherhood aren't mutually exclusive. But what if you fail? What if your career stalls? What if people judge your commitment?" Sarah interrupted gently. "Then you'll handle it the same way every successful person handles setbacks. You'll adapt, learn, and find another path to your goals. The difference is that now you have proof it can be done." Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the lingering worry in her daughter's eyes. "Let me tell you something I learned during all those years of fighting my way back," Sarah continued. "The fear never completely goes away. Every promotion, every new assignment, every major decision, there's always a voice asking if you really belong, if you're really good enough, if you're really making the right choice. The courage isn't in silencing that voice, it's in acting despite it." 6 months later, Emma gave birth to Sarah's first granddaughter, whom they named Hope. As Sarah held her granddaughter for the first time, she marveled at how much the world had changed since her own daughter's birth. This baby would grow up in a world where women served in combat, commanded major military units, and led international peacekeeping operations. She would see female generals, admirals, and secretaries of defense as normal rather than exceptional. If she chose military service, she would never have to choose between that service and starting a family. "What are you thinking about, Grandma?" Emma asked, watching her mother cradle the sleeping baby. "I'm thinking about time," Sarah replied. "How everything that seemed permanent when you were born has changed. How the struggles that defined my generation have become history lessons for yours. Do you think her generation will have it easier?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Different challenges, but not necessarily easier ones. Every generation has to prove itself, has to earn its place, has to fight for the changes it believes in. But she'll start from a higher baseline, with more options and fewer artificial barriers. Any advice for her future?" Sarah looked down at Hope's peaceful face, thinking about all the advice she had given over the years to women facing various challenges and opportunities. "Same advice I gave you, and that my mother gave me, and that her grandmother gave her. Be excellent at whatever you choose to do. Treat people with respect, but don't accept disrespect in return. Remember that no is often just the first step in a longer negotiation. And never let anyone convince you that you have to choose between different parts of who you are." Over the following years, Sarah's influence extended far beyond the military community. Her memoir, Second Chances, A General's Journey from Discharge to Command, became a bestseller and was adapted into a successful documentary film. She served on corporate boards, advised government agencies, and spoke at universities around the world. But her greatest satisfaction came from the steady stream of letters and emails from women whose careers had been shaped by her example. There were military officers who had navigated pregnancy and promotion simultaneously, corporate executives who had returned to leadership roles after family-related career breaks, and young women who had chosen challenging career paths, partly because they had proof that setbacks could be overcome. "You've become a symbol," Marcus observed one evening as Sarah responded to emails from around the world. "I've become proof of concept," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Symbols inspire from a distance. Proof of concept shows that something specific is achievable under specific circumstances. And what have you proven? That institutions can change. That setbacks don't have to be permanent. That individual persistence can create systemic transformation. That you don't have to choose between different aspects of who you are, you just have to figure out how to integrate them effectively." As Sarah entered her 70s, she began to think about legacy in more concrete terms. The Second Chances Foundation was thriving under new leadership. Her policy recommendations had been incorporated into military doctrine, and hundreds of women had successfully returned to service after career interruptions. But the legacy she was most proud of was cultural rather than institutional. The generation of military leaders who had come of age during her active service took gender integration for granted in ways that previous generations never could. They saw competence as the primary qualification for leadership, regarded family obligations as normal rather than disqualifying, and understood that diverse perspectives strengthened rather than weakened military effectiveness. The real victory? Sarah told a group of military historians documenting her career, "Isn't that I became a general despite being discharged for pregnancy. It's that my granddaughter will never understand why that was remarkable." To her generation, the idea that pregnancy could end a military career will seem as archaic as not allowing women to vote. The historians pressed her on this point. Hadn't individual achievement always been important? Wasn't her personal success significant regardless of its broader impact? Individual success matters, Sarah agreed. But individual success that doesn't contribute to systemic change is ultimately limited. If I had been the only woman to return from pregnancy discharge and achieve general officer rank, that would have been a curiosity rather than a transformation. The real success is that I was the first of many, not the only one. On her 75th birthday, Sarah received a surprise that moved her more than any military decoration or civilian honor ever had. Emma organized a reunion of women whose careers had been touched by Sarah's example: military officers, corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, and government officials who had all, in some way, benefited from her willingness to fight for institutional change. "We wanted to show you something," Emma explained as nearly 100 women gathered in the hotel ballroom. "We wanted you to see the compound effect of your choices." One by one, the women shared their stories. There was Admiral Patricia Rodriguez, the Navy's first female fleet commander, who had returned to service after a pregnancy discharge using Sarah's path as a template. There was Senator Janet Thompson, who had cited Sarah's example when advocating for military family support legislation. There was Dr. Maria Santos, who had left corporate law to establish legal aid services for discharged military personnel. Each story was different, but all shared common elements: a career setback that seemed permanent, a decision to fight rather than accept defeat, and a commitment to making the path easier for those who came after. "What you taught us," said Commander Amanda Foster, now a respected naval strategist, "wasn't just that comeback was possible. You taught us that comeback was our responsibility, to ourselves, to our families, and to the women who would face similar challenges in the future." Sarah listened to these stories with a mixture of pride and humility. She had always known that her choices had influenced others, but seeing the cumulative effect was overwhelming. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah looked out at faces that represented decades of progress and transformation. "When I was discharged in 1987, she began, "I thought my story was ending. I couldn't imagine that 35 years later, I would be standing in a room full of women who had turned their own setbacks into comebacks, their own struggles into strength, their own challenges into opportunities to serve others." She paused, thinking about the young lieutenant who had packed her belongings in shame so many years ago. "But here's what I learned during those years in the wilderness. Our individual stories matter, but they matter most when they become part of a larger narrative of progress. Each of you took the proof that comeback was possible and used it to create your own version of success. More importantly, you've made it easier for the next generation to achieve things we couldn't even imagine." The evening concluded with a presentation that brought Sarah to tears. The women had established a scholarship fund in her name, providing financial support for women veterans pursuing advanced education after career interruptions. The first recipient was a young Marine who had been medically discharged after an injury and was now studying international relations with the goal of returning to government service. "This is how change really happens," Sarah told Marcus as they drove home that evening. "Not through individual heroics, but through collective action." Each woman in that room made different choices, followed different paths, achieved different kinds of success. But together, they've created a foundation that makes advancement possible for women they'll never meet. "Are you satisfied with how it all turned out?" Marcus asked. Sarah thought about the question seriously. Satisfaction seemed too small a word for the complex emotions she felt looking back on her career and its impact. "I'm grateful," she said finally. Grateful for the setbacks that taught me resilience. Grateful for the support that made comeback possible. Grateful for the opportunities to prove that change was achievable. And most of all, grateful for the chance to be part of something larger than any individual career or achievement. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah saw Emma's car already there. Inside, she found her daughter and granddaughter waiting with a surprise, a letter from the Secretary of Defense announcing that the Army's new leadership development program for women officers would be named in Sarah's honor. The Sarah Chen Leadership Institute, Emma read aloud, will provide advanced training and mentorship for female officers transitioning back to active duty after career interruptions, ensuring that the military retains and develops its most talented leaders regardless of the path they take to achieve their potential. Sarah held hope, now a toddler full of questions and energy, and tried to explain what the announcement meant. "Grandma helped change the rules," she said simply. "She made it so that mommies can be soldiers too, and soldiers can be mommies too, and nobody has to choose between the two things." Hope nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense, which Sarah supposed it did to someone who had never known a world where such choices were necessary. Later that evening, after Emma and Hope had gone home, Sarah and Marcus sat on their back porch watching the sunset. The Virginia countryside was peaceful, marked by the gentle sounds of evening birds and distant traffic. "Any final thoughts?" Marcus asked, echoing a question he had posed regularly throughout their marriage. Sarah smiled, thinking about how many times they had sat on this porch discussing challenges, celebrating successes, and planning for the future. "I'm thinking about continuity," she said. "How the struggles of one generation become the starting point for the next. How individual choices compound over time into institutional change. How the young woman who was discharged for pregnancy became the grandmother watching her granddaughter grow up in a world where such discrimination is unthinkable. Full circle? More like an upward spiral. We end up in a similar place but at a higher level with greater understanding and more possibilities." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from discharge to general to grandmother. It had been longer and more complicated than she had ever imagined when she first put on a uniform as a second lieutenant full of dreams and determination. But perhaps that was the point. The best journeys were never straight lines from one predetermined destination to another. They were winding paths that led through valleys of challenge and peaks of achievement, teaching lessons that could only be learned through experience and creating opportunities that could only be seized through perseverance. The young lieutenant who had been escorted off Fort Stewart in 1987 and the retired general sitting on her Virginia porch in 2023 were the same person, shaped by the same core values but transformed by decades of growth, struggle, and service. Both versions of herself had been necessary, the first to dream big dreams, the second to prove they could be achieved despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As Sarah finally headed inside for the night, she paused at her study door, looking at the wall where her commission certificate hung next to her discharge papers. Two documents that told the same story from different perspectives, one focusing on an ending, the other on a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new women seeking proof that comebacks were possible. Sarah would be ready for them, just as others had been ready for her all those years ago when she needed to believe that second chances were real. The cycle would continue, as it always had and always would, with each generation building on the struggles and successes of those who came before, pushing the boundaries of possibility a little further, opening doors a little wider, making the path a little easier for those who would follow. It was, Sarah thought as she turned off the lights, exactly the kind of legacy worth fighting for.